Hello and welcome to the first video lecture of Sacraments and Worship. Today I'm going to talk about the course title, Theology of the Sacraments and of Worship, and why the course has that title. I'm also going to talk about the understanding of the word liturgy we're going to use it in this class, and we'll be talking about the 20th century and the changes in our understanding of those three words in the 20th century. Next time, when I give you the second lecture, we'll talk a little bit more about how this definition developed and how the word sacrament came to mean what it does over time, especially before the modern period. But for today, I'm just going to give you an overview of what we'll be talking about for the rest of this very short course. At the end of this lecture, I want you to read the Sacramental and Liturgical Theology 1900 to 2000 essay that's linked from our Moodle page, which really is focusing on what happened in Catholic sacramental and liturgical theology over the course of the 20th century. The word sacrament first. The Greek term that's used in the New Testament and in other early church writings is mysterion, or mystery. We'll talk a little bit more about that term in the next lecture. The Latin term that's generally used to translate it is the word sacramentum, which basically means a sacred sign. In the medieval period, this word sacramentum, which at first would have been a more general term, was defined to mean only 7 rites of the Church. That is, the rites of initiation, baptism, confirmation, and Eucharist, the rites of vocation, as they're sometimes called, marriage, and holy orders, and the rites of healing, which are anointing of the sick, sometimes known as extreme unction, and reconciliation, sometimes known as penance. We will be talking about those rites a little bit in this semester, but as I told you before, we will mostly be focusing on the sacrament of baptism, and then we'll get some general understanding of the term sacrament that would apply to all of them. The traditional definition of sacrament by the beginning of the 20th century had 4 terms. The sacrament was an outward sign, so it was something that was sensible. It could be tangible, audio, it's audible, visible. It caused grace, so causing grace. We'll talk more about what grace means in a few minutes. It was instituted by Christ's power. This was a very important point of conflict between the Reformers and the Catholic Church of the Middle Ages, which we'll talk about next time. And it was for the sanctification of human beings. So there was something visible or tangible which caused grace in the soul, something that Christ had begun when he was here on earth, and it was something that was saving human beings. So not everything that Christ did on earth would count as a sacrament. That's what's important about that last one. So in the Roman Church, for example, foot washing wasn't considered a sacrament, although some early churches did think of it as sacrament. Now, what does that have to do? Why then do we need worship? Well, if we look at this definition of sacrament, you will notice that this definition really emphasizes what God is doing in the sacrament and not very much about what human beings are doing. What this meant was by early in the 20th century, there were basically a very hard and fast list of things that needed to be done in order for a sacrament to actually work, and as long as those things were done, the sacrament worked. It didn't really matter whether the people came to the sacrament really with a real desire of grace or a real understanding of what was happening. There was a very objective understanding of what was necessary for a sacrament to work. That has altered over the course of the 20th century, and that's what you'll be reading about in the reading for today. Worship is in the course title because we want to remember a balance between what God does in our liturgical rites and our ritual celebrations and what human beings do. So worship means the human reverence for God and its expression in public rituals. It relates to this word in Greek liturgia, which we'll be talking about more, liturgy, which is the work of the people. What you'll see over the course of the 20th century in the essay and also in the class as we go through many of the readings that I talk about in the essay is you'll see that the sacrament, the work that God is doing and the way that God is sanctifying human beings and the work that human beings are doing in the ritual and the symbols they're using to express their reverence for God are very closely tied to one another. That was easily forgotten in the early 20th century and is much better remembered today. So that's what we'll be talking about, or we'll be seeing really in the readings we're doing over the course of this semester. So let's go to the word liturgy. A liturgy is sacrament and worship. Sacrament, the term sacrament over the course of the 20th century was broadened very, very gradually until we really think not only of there being 7 sacraments, although that's still important, but also that life itself, and especially the liturgical life of the church, is sacramental. In other words, in the liturgies of the church broadly, God is doing something for the life of the church. So if we look at liturgy, what do we see? Well, liturgy is a symbolic encounter between God and humanity. It's a place where God and humanity meet. So it's both God's work that we saw before, which we usually call grace, which you can think of as a God to human beings downward if you want to use a, up and down cosmology. Sometimes it's called the katabatic dimension. I won't use that term very much in this course, but you might see it in some of the readings, so I have it here. There's also worship. Worship is the humans to God, the upward or the anabatic dimension. Again, I won't use the word anabatic too much in this course, but I did want you to recognize it if you saw it. So these encounters, this grace, God reaches out to human beings through the sacraments, and especially through the symbols that are used in the Christian liturgy. At the same time, human beings respond to God by reaching out towards God in these same symbolic encounters in which they experience God's grace. So we want to have a kind of balance between those, which is why the course has the title it does. So in 20th century sacramental theology, and again, this is only the very, very briefest of summaries of what you'll see, hopefully, in more detail in the article. At the beginning of the century, the 20th century, we had basically one distinction in Catholic sacramental theology. We wanted to know, is a sacrament valid and is it licit? The word valid means that it was done according to the very most basic and objective structural belief about this has to be done at the base minimum of what needs to be done for the sacrament to happen. So if you take baptism for an example, the base minimum for baptism to happen was there needed to be water, three washings of water by a valid minister, which in a pinch could be anybody for baptism, and there needed to be the right formula, which is in the West, I baptize you so and so in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. So that was all that was necessary for a baptism to be valid. Now, if a baptism was valid, that meant it worked. Nothing really more to worry about. There might be some details, maybe it could have been better, but that wasn't really of large importance. It wasn't thought about very highly at the turn of the 20th century. The other distinction we have is licit, which literally means legal or lawful. So a licit baptism would be one that was done according to the church's canon law, and an illicit baptism would be one that wasn't done according to the church's canon law. So even if it's illicit, if it was valid, it would still work. But if you made some mistake, like suppose you baptized in non-consecrated water when there was no danger of death and you hadn't consecrated the water beforehand, that would be an illicit baptism, but it would still be valid, and so the baptism would still be effective. So this was the concern at the beginning of the 20th century, and as I'll talk about in the article that you're going to read, there was a lot more attention paid under these categories to how the minister approached the sacraments and what was required of him, or in the case of baptism, perhaps of her, than there was for the subject. So the what the subject needed to bring to the sacrament was really not something that people thought a lot about in sacramental theology at the turn of the 20th century, because it was thought that even if the subject came and didn't really have a lot of interest in what was happening, as long as the sacrament was valid, it would still take effect, and then, piety and repentance later could make up the difference. So you'll see more about that again in the article. Starting in around the First World War, but especially picking up the pace after the Second World War, we see what we usually call the turn to the subject. And I know I did talk about this when I was going through the syllabus, but I'm going to talk about it again, and you will see it a lot when we're reading Sacrament and Worship, because that's especially where we see the turn to the subject in this class. The turn to the subject responds to that imbalance that I just talked about, where there's a lot of attention paid to the minister and that role, but there's very little attention paid to the subject, and says that actually, since the sacraments are communication between two persons, God and human beings, or a human being, that the human being who is the subject of the communication plays a huge role in determining whether that communication is going to actually work or not. So when we see Ronner and we see Skilabix, we're going to see what may seem to you unsurprising, but what was for them in that time period an amazing amount of attentiveness to the sacramental subject as one agent or one side of this relationship. After that, beginning with Ronner, but especially in the 1980s, 1970s, 80s, and 90s, we see what we might call the turn to language. And in this class, you'll see that with Louis-Marie Chauvet, with Nathan Mitchell, and some of the other writers that we read later on in the semester, well, in the 3 weeks. In the turn to language responds to the turn to the subject by saying, if this is a communication between persons, then our best way of understanding communications between persons is to use language and symbol, which is how human beings communicate with one another. And so these later writers will use especially language as a way of talking about what's happening in the sacraments and trying to understand how human beings and God communicate through sacraments. Another thing that's very important that happens in the 20th century and really impacts sacramental theology is the transformation of what we mean by the word grace. And I did not talk about this in the essay you'll be reading because it will be elsewhere in the handbook. But the old definition, the one that would have been assumed early on in the 20th century, treats grace as an objective thing, almost as if the best way of thinking about it is like a fluid, almost. So if you think about this language, the sacraments contain grace. This is a traditional adage from the Middle Ages. And we say that persons have grace. Sometimes we say are in a state of grace, which is more of a location. But these words make you think of grace as a kind of fluid that's held in the sacrament as a vessel and then gets poured into the human person, as if there might be, a cylinder with a measurement on the side. Maybe I could measure how much grace I had. At some point in the 20th century, we realized that this was a very poor way of thinking about grace. The reason it's a poor way of thinking about grace is that it allows us to forget the fact that grace is not actually a measurable quantity where I'm hoping that at the moment that I die, I'll have at least 1,000 milliliters of grace because that means I'm going to heaven. This is not a good way of thinking about our relationship with God. Instead, we think about how grace is a relationship that God initiates. That's why I have here that grace is a gift of God's self, and that we respond to by living in a relationship with God and by acting for God with other persons. So I have here subjective, and the reason I have subjective is because many times in the contemporary world when we say subjective, we mean simply it differs from person to person and it's hard to work out exactly what it is or even if there is anything there real. That's not what we mean by subjective in the context of sacramental theology. When we're talking about sacramental theology, we're talking about something that's more than objectively true. It's also true. It's a real relationship, something that might be immeasurable but is real and actual. So I hope that's helpful. If you want to think about it this way, um, you can't have an objective measure of love either, but a subjective measure of love. The fact that love is subjective doesn't make it less real. It means that a subjective reality is one that only a subject, that is, only a person, can perceive. And that makes it, in this context, more real, not less. All right, so now we come to liturgical theology, which is what we'll be doing in here, and sacrament, how we think about sacraments from the context of liturgical theology. First of all, this may not seem radical, but it would have been at the beginning of the 20th century. Sacraments are liturgy. This is quite obvious, really. The sacraments are not a kind of thing that is just different from all other kinds of liturgy. It's a particular kind of liturgy that's done for particular purposes. So we'll talk about that. And most of what we say about sacraments in this class would apply to other liturgies as well. It's just that these intellectual tools were developed for dealing with the 7 rites of the church that are usually called sacraments, and then it was sort of discovered that they had a broader application. So what does it mean to say that sacraments are liturgy? Well, one thing that we can derive from that is that liturgy is determined by its context. So the way we interpret what we're doing in liturgy is contextual. A liturgy at a large, old, empty cathedral in a run-down, lower class part of Philadelphia is going to feel very different than a liturgy in a white, suburban, upper middle class uh, location outside of the Twin Cities. And that doesn't mean that either one of these two contexts is wrong. What it does mean is that symbolic communication in one place might be read differently than it is in another place. It's not always really obvious how that's going to work. Like, for example, suppose you had a extremely rich vestment that was being used in this Philadelphia poor church. It might be in that context that this vestment would be seen as frivolous or even offensive because of the poor people that are worshiping there. It might also be, and sometimes this does happen, that that vestment would be seen as a real honor to those people. So the main thing that we learn from this is that we have to know what the context is before we start developing, critiquing, understanding our liturgical symbols. But we didn't know that at the beginning of the 20th century. We're still working on it now. The third one, liturgy is ritual. This may, again, seem too obvious to even need to be said, but at the beginning of the 20th century, the Christian sacraments would have been very strongly defined against the rituals of other primitive peoples. The primitive is how it would have been thought of then, not how I think about it. So in other words, we would have said, well, there's all those terrible sacrificial religions of, those Polynesian tribes and so on. And then there's what we do, which isn't ritual, it's liturgy. That's not true. We have discovered since then that just like the tribes of the Polynesian islands and everybody else has their rituals that are both determined by their symbolic systems and also reinforce those symbolic systems. At the same time, our liturgy does the same thing for us. That doesn't mean our liturgy isn't important. It just means it's a ritual, just as those other cultures have their other rituals. So ritual is something human, which means that we can apply to it some of the same understandings of how symbols work in other contexts that we would use for other kinds of ritual or other kinds of human interaction. This is part of the turn to language that I talked about earlier. At the same time, ritual is transformative. It's not mere wishful thinking. Actually, ritual does, at long practice, change people. So we have, even on the human level, even the worship side of things, uh, liturgy can be transformative and can change us. And we have the grace by which God changes us through God's own outreach to human beings. All right, at this point, I want to demonstrate this, perhaps a little counterintuitively, by showing you a video. This video is by a Jewish group called the Maccabees, and this is a parody video in which they're writing about, or they're singing rather, about the days of awe, which are the high holy days of contemporary Judaism. The reason I'm showing this video is because, well, first of all, it's a lot of fun, but also I think to step outside our own liturgical tradition can sometimes give us better eyes. So I'm going to show this video and then I'll go through it again and talk about some of the things that I think are remarkable about this video.
Choose right, got a room, not a place in.
All right, so if I'm going to play that video one more time, but I want to think about these three key concepts that play out in this video in order to make liturgy transformative. The first is the concept of remembrance, or especially you see in this video a celebration of attentiveness, living attentively and not rushing through so quickly that you can't remember what it is you're doing. The second is a change of perspective. In the first half of this video, the young men are making mistake after mistake that go against the values that they hold dear. In the middle of the video, the Days of Awe, the liturgical celebration, which is an annual celebration in the fall, become this moment that forces them to slow down and remember, and that changes their perspective on how it is that they're supposed to live. So there's this inner relationship of the liturgy that they go to. You see it at the end, but there's actually a moment in the middle where they all come together and they see a sign on the ground. And at that moment, there's a change of perspective that links their liturgical celebration that's coming up, to their ethical lives and the values that they hold dear that they've allowed to kind of slip away from them. So then in the second half of the video, you see them living out their values as the liturgy has called them back to that. And then at the end, of course, there's a really lovely picture of the liturgical celebration of the Days of Awe. So let's go through the video again, since I've watched it a few hundred times and you presumably have not. Here's the temple at which you see the celebration at the end, so it's almost a bookend of the video. Now this is the turning point of the video, and you can see from this point on not only a living out of their ethical lives in the sense that they're not doing the wrong thing, but you can see an active engagement with the world that's really positive and life-giving.
Sure.
jokes are one of a bunch of running gags that appear in all their videos.
To everyone.
So, where does that leave us? At the end of the 20th century, it leaves us with a very complicated task, whereas at the beginning of the 20th century, the task of the sacraments was fairly easy. You just did what it said in the rule book and you made sure that you did it right. At the end of the 20th century and here now in the 21st century, we know that things are a little more complicated. If we expect our liturgies to speak to people, we need to make liturgies that are capable of speaking both on the human level and are capable of bearing the weight of revelation as far as that revelation brings us the grace that God offers. So that's actually a very difficult task and one that we'll be continuing to talk about for this semester. I don't take it, I take it seriously. So I will be talking to you next time on the pre-modern understanding of sacrament and how we got to that early 20th century definition, but then also what can we take from that pre-modern work in the 21st century to enrich our liturgies.